Hello, welcome back to Insomnia History, where we uncover the darkest and most thrilling stories from the past to light up your night. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because that's what keeps us going, bringing you more captivating tales, night after night. Now, let's journey back to the 14th century, to a fateful night when the King of France dared to send armed men to kidnap the Pope himself. A shocking power play that shook the foundations of medieval Europe. Are you ready? Let's get started. The year is 1303. The Western Christian world is united under one church, with its spiritual and administrative center in Rome. The Pope is not merely a religious leader, but a political figure wielding tremendous power. Kings and emperors bow before him, seeking his blessing and legitimacy for their rules. At least, that's how it had been for centuries. But as we enter the 14th century, this long-standing order is about to face its greatest challenge. To understand this extraordinary confrontation, we must first meet our protagonists, Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip IV of France, two of the most powerful and ambitious men of their age. Their clash would shake the foundations of medieval society and forever alter the balance of power between church and state. Pope Boniface VIII, born Benedetto Caetani around 1230, ascended to the papal throne in December 1294, following the unprecedented resignation of his predecessor, Pope Celestine I. Boniface was not a humble spiritual leader, but a shrewd politician and trained lawyer who had spent decades climbing the ecclesiastical ladder. Tall and imposing, with a commanding presence and penetrating gaze, he embodied papal authority in its most uncompromising form. Contemporary accounts describe him as eloquent, learned, and exceptionally self-assured, perhaps to the point of arrogance. Unlike his predecessor, who had been a simple hermit reluctantly dragged into the papacy, Boniface embraced power wholeheartedly. He was determined to assert the supreme authority of the Church over all temporal matters. In his view, the Pope stood at the apex of Christian society, with all earthly rulers subject to his spiritual oversight. This was not a new doctrine, but Boniface pursued it with particular vigor at a time when monarchs were increasingly resistant to papal interference. Boniface came from the powerful Caetani family of Anagni, a hilltop town about 40 miles southeast of Rome. Through his decades of service to the Church, he had amassed considerable wealth and influence. He used his position to advance his family's interests, appointing relatives to key ecclesiastical positions and acquiring lands to expand the Caetani domains. This nepotism, while common practice among medieval popes, would later feature prominently in the accusations leveled against him. A patron of the arts and an enthusiastic builder, Boniface commissioned magnificent works to glorify both the Church and himself. His most ambitious project was the renovation and expansion of the papal palace in Rome, transforming it into a symbol of papal majesty. He also commissioned the great artist Giotto to decorate the new Lateran loggia with frescoes, and sponsored numerous other architectural and artistic undertakings throughout the papal states. Across the Alps, in France, we find our second protagonist, Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair or Philip le Bel for his handsome appearance. Born in 1268, he ascended to the French throne in 1285 at just 17 years old. By 1303, he had been ruling France for nearly 2 decades, gradually consolidating royal power and building what many historians consider one of the first modern states in Europe. Unlike the expressive and imperious Boniface, Philip was an enigmatic figure. Contemporary chronicles describe him as tall, fair-haired, and physically impressive, but strangely detached and inscrutable. Neither man nor beast, but a statue, one observer noted. Philip rarely displayed emotion, preferring to operate through his close circle of skilled and ruthlessly efficient advisors. many of whom came from the rising class of professional lawyers rather than the traditional nobility. Philip's reign marked a crucial period in the development of the French monarchy, building on the foundations laid by his grandfather, Louis IX, later canonized as St. Louis. Philip worked systematically to strengthen royal administration, extend the king's justice throughout the realm, and assert his authority over both the nobility and the church within his territories. Unlike previous French kings, who had often been seen as first among equals among the great feudal lords, Philip envisioned a truly sovereign monarchy. Central to Philip's state-building project was a chronic need for money. The medieval French crown had limited regular income, yet Philip's ambitious policies, including intermittent wars with England over control of territories in southwestern France, required substantial funds. This financial pressure would become a key factor in his conflict with Boniface VIII. The Europe in which these two powerful figures operated was undergoing profound changes. The 13th century had seen remarkable growth in population, trade, and urban life. Universities had flourished, producing a new class of educated professionals who staffed royal and papal administrations. Gothic cathedrals soared above growing cities, testifying to the wealth and ambition of the age. By 1300, however, this period of expansion was reaching its limits. Population growth had outstripped agricultural productivity, leading to periodic famines. The monetary system was under strain, with kings frequently debasing their currencies to finance wars and administration. The nascent banking systems, centered in Italian cities like Florence and Siena, facilitated trade but also created new forms of financial dependency. Politically, Europe remained a patchwork of competing jurisdictions. The Holy Roman Empire, nominally ruling Central Europe and parts of Italy, was weakened by internal divisions. Italy was fragmented among city-states, papal territories, and the Kingdom of Naples. Spain was divided between Christian kingdoms, slowly reconquering territory from Muslim rule, and England was emerging as a coherent kingdom with its own imperial ambitions in France, Ireland, and Wales. Within this complex landscape, the Catholic Church stood as the one truly international institution. Its network of dioceses, monasteries, and parishes extended across Western Christendom. The Pope claimed universal jurisdiction over all Christians, with the power to excommunicate even kings and emperors, theoretically placing them beyond the Christian community and delegitimizing their rule. This claim to universal authority had been forcefully asserted during the investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries, when popes had successfully challenged the Holy Roman Emperor's control over ecclesiastical appointments. Pope Innocent III of 1216, had further extended papal influence, intervening in the internal affairs of kingdoms throughout Europe, and even receiving the submission of King John of England, who agreed to hold his kingdom as a papal fief. However, by Boniface's time, this papal supremacy was increasingly contested. The growing administrative sophistication of kingdoms like France and England enabled their rulers to exercise more effective control over their territories. These monarchs increasingly viewed the church within their realms as a national institution that should serve royal interests, not an independent power answerable only to Rome. The relationship between Boniface VIII and Philip IV had not always been adversarial. In the early years of Boniface's pontificate, relations between the papacy and France were cordial. Boniface had negotiated the peace treaty of 1298 between France and England, and had canonized Philip's grandfather, Louis IX, in 1297, elevating him to sainthood as Saint Louis of France. This canonization was both a spiritual honor and a political boon for the Capetian dynasty, enhancing its prestige and legitimacy. But beneath these gestures of goodwill lay fundamentally different conceptions of authority. Boniface was committed to the traditional view that secular rulers derived their legitimacy from the church. and were subject to papal oversight in matters touching on sin and salvation. Philip and his advisors, meanwhile, were developing the concept of royal sovereignty that recognized no superior authority within the French realm, not even the popes. These competing visions of power might have remained theoretical disputes had it not been for the pressing fiscal needs of both the French crown and the papacy. Both institutions required ever-increasing revenues to support their expanding administrations and ambitions. The Church possessed vast wealth within France, including extensive landholdings that were largely exempt from royal taxation. For a cash-strapped monarchy, these untaxed ecclesiastical resources represented a tempting target. As the 13th century drew to a close, these tensions were exacerbated by broader conflicts, reshaping European politics. The papacy was engaged in a bitter struggle with the powerful Colonna family in Rome, who challenged Boniface's election. The French monarchy was locked in intermittent warfare with England over territories in Gascony, and both France and the papacy were involved in complex diplomatic maneuvering over the crown of Sicily and influence in the fragmented Italian peninsula. Meanwhile, a subtle but significant shift was occurring in intellectual circles. Scholars trained in Roman law were advancing theories of royal authority that challenged traditional ecclesiastical supremacy. In Paris, at the university established under royal patronage, theologians and legal scholars were questioning the extent of papal power, particularly in what they considered purely temporal matters. Philip's court became a center for these emerging nationalist and royalist ideas. His chief advisors, men like Pierre Flotte, Guillaume de Nogaret, and Enguerrand de Marigny, were committed to enhancing royal power at the expense of competing authorities, whether feudal lords, town communes, or the church. They brought to their task the formidable intellectual tools of legal training, combined with ruthless political pragmatism. For his part, Boniface surrounded himself with canon lawyers and theologians who elaborated ever more comprehensive theories of papal supremacy. The papal curia, the administrative heart of the church, became increasingly sophisticated, but also increasingly expensive to maintain. To fund its operations, the papacy developed new mechanisms for extracting revenue from the church throughout Europe, creating further friction with secular authorities. By the final years of the 13th century, these ideological, political, and financial tensions were coming to a head. The stage was set for a confrontation between the two most powerful authorities in Western Christendom, the Universal Church, led by Pope Boniface VIII, and the French monarchy under Philip IV. Neither man was inclined to compromise when it came to fundamental principles of authority. Boniface, approaching 70 years of age by 1300, was determined to uphold the traditional prerogatives of the papacy against what he saw as encroachment by secular rulers. Philip, not yet 40, was equally committed to asserting royal sovereignty within his realm, unfettered by external interference, even from Rome. The specific issue that would ignite their conflict was taxation. As warfare between France and England intensified in the 1290s, both kings sought to tap the wealth of the church within their realms to finance their military campaigns. This threatened not only the church's treasured exemption from secular taxation, but also the Pope's exclusive right to authorize extraordinary levies on ecclesiastical property. The brewing conflict reflected not just a clash of personalities or policies, but a fundamental transition in the European political order. The Universalist vision of Christendom, united under papal leadership, was giving way to a Europe of sovereign states, each claiming exclusive authority within its borders. Boniface VIII and Philip IV stood at the historical fulcrum of this momentous shift, and neither fully grasped the historical forces they were unleashing. As the new century dawned, the tension between these two powers would escalate from diplomatic disagreements to open confrontation, culminating in an act of violence that would shock the medieval world. and permanently alter the relationship between church and state in Western Europe. The conflict between Boniface VIII and Philip IV erupted in earnest in 1296, triggered by a seemingly mundane yet politically explosive issue: taxation. Both England and France were engaged in costly military campaigns, with Philip fighting against Edward I of England over territories in Gascony. These wars strained royal treasuries to their limits, forcing monarchs to seek new revenue sources. The vast wealth of the church, largely exempt from secular taxation, presented an attractive target. In England, Edward I demanded a tax amounting to half the annual income of the clergy. In France, Philip imposed similar extraordinary levies on ecclesiastical properties and revenues. These actions represented a direct challenge to the traditional immunity of church property from secular taxation, a principle the papacy had defended for centuries as essential to the church's independence. Boniface VIII responded swiftly and decisively. On February 24, 1296, he issued the papal bull Claricis Laicos, a forceful assertion of ecclesiastical immunity from royal taxation. The bull's opening lines set its confrontational tone. Antiquity shows us that laymen have always been hostile to the clergy. It went on to forbid all clergy from paying taxes to secular rulers without explicit papal approval, and threatened excommunication for any cleric who complied with such demands and any secular authority who imposed them. The language of Claricis Laicos was deliberately broad, addressing all Christian monarchs. Yet its timing and context made clear that its primary targets were the kings of England and France. For Boniface, the issue transcended mere financial concerns. He viewed taxation of the clergy, without papal consent, as a fundamental violation of the Church's liberty and a dangerous precedent that threatened the hierarchical order of Christendom. Philip IV perceived the papal bull as a direct assault on his royal sovereignty and fiscal autonomy. His reaction was swift and ruthlessly pragmatic. Rather than challenging the bull's theological or canonical basis, Philip struck at the papacy's financial lifeline. In August 1296, he issued a royal ordinance prohibiting the export of gold, silver, jewels, weapons, and horses from France without special royal permission. This export ban represented a masterstroke of economic warfare. The papacy relied heavily on revenues from France, the wealthiest kingdom in Europe, and home to approximately 1/3 of all Latin Christendom's bishoprics. By blocking these financial flows, Philip effectively cut off a major source of papal income. The French king's advisors had identified and exploited a crucial vulnerability in the papacy's position. While the pope could threaten spiritual sanctions, the king controlled the physical territory and could regulate the movement of material resources. Boniface quickly recognized the severity of this fiscal stranglehold. The papal treasury was already under strain from expensive building projects and the costs of conflict with the Colonna family in Rome. The loss of French revenues posed an existential threat to the papacy's operations. Faced with this economic reality, Boniface was forced to seek accommodation. On September 20th, 1296, less than 7 months after issuing Claricis Laicos, Boniface published a new bull, Ineffabilis Amor, which adopted a markedly conciliatory tone toward France. While maintaining the theoretical principles of Claricis Laicos, Boniface clarified that the bull did not prohibit voluntary contributions from the clergy or payments in cases of necessity for the defense of the realm. He also explicitly acknowledged the special position of France as the most Christian kingdom with which the Holy See had particularly close ties. Philip, sensing advantage, maintained pressure by keeping the export ban in place. Boniface responded with further concessions. In February 1297, he issued another bull, Etsi de Statu, which effectively exempted France from the key provisions of Claricis Laicos. The Pope now explicitly permitted the French king to impose taxes on the clergy in cases of urgent necessity, without requiring specific papal approval each time. Boniface also canonized Philip's grandfather, Louis IX, as a gesture of reconciliation. This first round of conflict had ended in a clear victory for Philip. Without formally repudiating Clericis Laicos, Boniface had been compelled to render it largely ineffective where France was concerned. The Pope had learned a harsh lesson about the practical limits of papal authority when confronted by a determined monarch controlling territory essential to the Church's financial well-being. The truce proved temporary. By 1300, new tensions were emerging on multiple fronts. Philip had begun prosecuting Bernard Cesset, the Bishop of Pamiers in southern France, on charges of treason, heresy, and blasphemy. Cesset, a proud and outspoken prelate, had allegedly made disparaging remarks about the king, questioning his legitimacy and comparing him unfavorably to his saintly grandfather. More substantively, Cesset had opposed royal officials' attempts to extend royal jurisdiction in his diocese. The case of Bernard Cesset touched on a fundamental principle of medieval church law: clerical immunity from secular justice. According to canonical tradition, bishops could only be tried by ecclesiastical courts, ultimately answerable to the Pope. By arresting and trying Cesset before his royal court, Philip was asserting his jurisdiction over clergy within his realm, another direct challenge to papal authority. Boniface viewed Philip's treatment of Cesset as an egregious violation of clerical immunity and papal prerogatives. In December 1301, he issued the bull Ausculta Filii, Listen, Son, addressed directly to Philip. In measured but firm language, Boniface reminded the king that God has set popes over kings and kingdoms, and summoned French bishops to a council in Rome to address the king's violations of ecclesiastical liberty. Ausculta Filii represented Boniface's attempt to reassert papal authority while avoiding direct confrontation. The bull acknowledged Philip's dignity as king, while firmly placing him in a subordinate position to papal authority in matters touching on sin and the Church's freedom. It enumerated a series of grievances against Philip's administration, including debasement of the currency, misappropriation of church revenues, and extension of royal justice at the expense of ecclesiastical courts. Philip and his advisors recognized the political danger posed by Ausculta Filii and responded with a sophisticated propaganda campaign. They circulated a crude forgery known as Diem Time, Fear God, purporting to be Boniface's actual bull. This forged document contained an extreme, abbreviated version of Boniface's claims, stating bluntly that the king was subject to the Pope in temporal as well as spiritual matters and demanding immediate submission. This propagandistic masterstroke allowed Philip to rally public opinion against what could be portrayed as papal overreach. In February 1302, Philip convened an assembly of representatives from the three estates of his realm: clergy, nobility, and townspeople. This was one of the earliest meetings of what would later develop into the Estates General, the French representative assembly. Before this assembly, royal lawyers presented the forged bull as evidence of the Pope's determination to subordinate the French kingdom to papal control. The French clergy, caught between loyalty to their king and obedience to the Pope, adopted an ambiguous position, urging reconciliation while acknowledging the king's independence in temporal affairs. The nobility and commons, however, rallied strongly behind Philip. In letters addressed to the College of Cardinals in Rome, they denounced Boniface's alleged claims and affirmed their support for the king's defense of French sovereignty. Boniface, unaware of the extent of Philip's propaganda and the forgery of his bull, proceeded with his plans for a council to address the French situation. Despite Philip's prohibition, some French bishops defied their king and traveled to Rome for the council. which opened in late October 1302. The council's deliberations took place against the backdrop of a humiliating military defeat for Philip. In July 1302, French forces had been routed by Flemish infantry at the Battle of Courtrai, also known as the Battle of the Golden Spurs. This defeat temporarily weakened Philip's position and may have emboldened Boniface to take a more forceful stance. On November 18, 1302, as the council was concluding, Boniface issued his most famous and controversial bull, Unam Sanctum. This document represented the most extreme statement of papal supremacy ever issued by a medieval pope. While not mentioning Philip or France by name, its target was unmistakable. Unam Sanctum opened with the assertion that there is one holy, Catholic, and apostolic church, outside of which there is neither salvation nor remission of sins. It proceeded to elaborate a comprehensive theory of papal supremacy, drawing on scripture, tradition, and theological reasoning to argue for the necessity of all human beings to be subject to the Roman pontiff. The bull's most provocative passage came near its conclusion. We declare, state, define, and pronounce that it is absolutely necessary for the salvation of all human beings that they submit to the Roman pontiff. This categorical statement appeared to make political submission to papal authority a condition of salvation itself, an extraordinary claim that went beyond previous formulations of papal power. Boniface may have intended Unam Sanctum primarily as a theoretical statement of traditional Catholic doctrine regarding papal primacy. However, in the context of his ongoing conflict with Philip IV, it was inevitably interpreted as a direct challenge to royal authority. The bull seemed to deny any legitimate autonomy to secular rulers, portraying them as mere instruments for executing the Church's will. Philip's response was calculated and devastating. Rather than engaging with the theological arguments of Unam Sanctum, he shifted the battlefield entirely by attacking Boniface's personal legitimacy as Pope. William of Nogret, Philip's chief legal advisor, and an implacable enemy of Boniface, emerged as the architect of this new strategy. In March 1303, at an assembly of French nobles, clergy, and lawyers in the Louvre, Nogret presented a shocking list of accusations against Boniface. The Pope was charged with heresy, simony, selling church offices, sodomy, sorcery, idolatry, and even murdering his predecessor, Celestine V. Nogret called for a general council of the church to try Boniface and depose him as a false pope and criminal. These allegations represented a radical escalation of the conflict. By challenging Boniface's legitimacy as pope, Philip and Nogret were attempting to undermine the very basis of his authority. If Boniface could be proven a heretic or illegitimate usurper, his pronouncements, including Unam Sanctum, would be rendered null and void. The charges against Boniface were largely fabricated or grossly exaggerated. The accusation regarding the murder of Celestine V was particularly absurd, as the elderly hermit had died in captivity after his abdication, but under conditions that hardly suggested foul play. Nevertheless, the accusations served their political purpose, providing a pretext for action against the Pope that could be justified as defense of the true faith against a corrupt impostor. Throughout the spring and summer of 1303, Philip's agents traveled throughout France gathering support for the call to try Boniface before a general council. The French clergy, under intense royal pressure, gradually aligned themselves with the king's position. Boniface, meanwhile, prepared a new bull, Super Petri Solio, which would have formally excommunicated Philip and released his subjects from their oaths of allegiance, effectively deposing him as king. As tensions reached their breaking point, Philip and Nogret decided on a bold and unprecedented course of action. Rather than waiting for Boniface to issue his threatened excommunication, they would send an armed force to Italy to seize the Pope physically, bring him to France, and force him to face trial before a general council under French control. This extraordinary plan marked a fundamental breach of the medieval political order. Physical violence against the Pope's person had been almost unthinkable in previous political conflicts. Even emperors who had challenged papal authority had generally limited themselves to installing antipopes through manipulated elections rather than physically attacking the pontiff. Nogrit departed France in the summer of 1303 with a small armed force and substantial funds. His mission was to proceed to Italy, recruit additional forces among Italian enemies of Boniface, and capture the Pope before he could publish the bull of excommunication against Philip. The stage was set for one of the most shocking episodes in medieval history, a direct assault on the person of the Pope by agents of a Christian king. The conflict that had begun over taxation rights and clerical immunity had escalated into an existential struggle over the very nature of authority in Christendom. The abstract principles debated in papal bulls and royal proclamations were about to manifest in physical violence, with consequences that would permanently alter the relationship between spiritual and temporal power in Europe. The Unam Sanctum Bull of November 1302 represented a watershed moment in the conflict between papal and royal authority. Though Boniface had issued it following the council in Rome, its ideas had been developing in papal circles for years. The document drew upon centuries of theological and political thought to create the most comprehensive statement of papal supremacy ever articulated. Its timing and content made it a direct response to Philip's increasingly aggressive assertions of royal autonomy. The bull's Latin title came from its opening words, Unam Sanctum Ecclesiam Catholicum, one holy Catholic Church. This beginning established the document's fundamental premise that there exists only one true church, outside of which, Boniface declared, there is neither salvation nor remission of sins. From this theological starting point, Boniface constructed an elaborate argument for papal supremacy that would have profound implications for secular rulers. Central to Unam Sanctum was the metaphor of the two swords, a concept derived from Luke 22:38, where the apostles tell Jesus, "Look, Lord, here are two swords," and Jesus replies, "It is enough." Medieval theologians had long interpreted these two swords as representing spiritual and temporal power. Boniface's innovation in Unam Sanctum was to assert unequivocally that both swords ultimately belong to the Church. Both swords, the spiritual and the temporal, are in the power of the Church, Boniface declared. The former is to be used by the Church, the latter for the Church, the former by the hand of the priest, the latter by the hand of kings and soldiers, but at the will and sufferance of the priest. This formulation left no doubt about the hierarchy. Temporal rulers wielded their power only with the Church's permission and ultimately under its authority. To bolster this claim, Boniface invoked a principle of hierarchical subordination that he believed governed all creation. According to the order of the universe, he wrote, all things are not equally and directly ordered, but the lowest through the intermediate, and the inferior through the superior. Just as the spiritual outranked the material in the divine order, Boniface argued, so must spiritual authority. The bull reached its crescendo in its final sentence, which has echoed through history. Furthermore, we declare, state, define, and pronounce that it is absolutely necessary for the salvation of all human beings that they submit to the Roman Pontiff. This extraordinary claim appeared to make political submission to papal authority a prerequisite for salvation itself. For monarchs like Philip, who were asserting their independence from papal oversight, this was nothing short of a spiritual declaration of war. Scholars continue to debate whether Boniface intended this final pronouncement to apply to political matters or merely to spiritual affairs. In context, however, the bull clearly asserted papal supremacy in both spheres. Even if Boniface meant only to restate traditional Catholic teaching about papal primacy, The political implications were inescapable, especially given the ongoing conflict with Philip. For the French king and his advisors, Unam Sanctum confirmed their worst fears about papal ambitions to subjugate secular rulers. They interpreted the bull as a direct assault on royal sovereignty and the emerging concept of national identity centered on the French crown. Philip could not accept Boniface's vision without effectively surrendering his independent authority as king. The French response was swift and devastating. Rather than engaging with the theological arguments of Unam Sanctum, Philip and his advisors executed a brilliant tactical shift. Instead of attacking the doctrine, they attacked the man. If Boniface could be proven unworthy of the papal office, his pronouncements would lose their authority. William of Novgorod emerged as the chief architect of this character assassination campaign. Born to parents who had allegedly been persecuted as Cathars, a heretical sect brutally suppressed by the church, Novgorod harbored a deep personal animosity toward the papacy. A brilliant lawyer trained at the University of Montpellier, he had risen rapidly in Philip's service, becoming one of the king's most trusted advisors and keeper of the seals, essentially the chief legal officer of the French crown. Novgorod possessed both the legal expertise to formulate charges against Boniface and the ruthless determination to see them through. He meticulously compiled a list of accusations designed to portray Boniface as not merely corrupt, but actively evil, a false pope who had usurped the Holy See through fraud and maintained it through crimes. On March 12, 1303, Philip convened an extraordinary assembly at the Louvre in Paris. Before an audience of French nobles, prelates, and legal scholars, Novgorod presented his explosive indictment of Pope Boniface VIII. The charges were sensational and wide-ranging, crafted to shock even those sympathetic to the papacy. Boniface was accused of heresy, denying the immortality of the soul and the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. He was charged with practicing black magic and consulting with a familiar demon. The Pope allegedly maintained an idol containing a captive evil spirit whom he worshipped. He was accused of sodomy and sexual perversion. Perhaps most dramatically, Novgorod claimed that Boniface had orchestrated the resignation of his predecessor, Celestine Wolf, and then murdered him in prison. The charge of heresy was particularly significant. Medieval canon law held that a heretical pope automatically ceased to be pope, since he had placed himself outside the church. If Boniface could be proven a heretic, his election would be invalidated retroactively, and all his decrees, including Unam Sanctum, would be rendered null and void. Novgorod concluded his presentation with a call for a general council of the church to try Boniface and remove him from office. This appeal to a general council was a shrewd tactical move. Church tradition held that a general council representing the entire church had authority even over the pope. By calling for such a council, Philip and Novgorod portrayed themselves not as attacking the papacy itself, but as defending the church from a corrupt usurper. Following the Louvre assembly, Philip launched a comprehensive propaganda campaign to build support for his position. Royal agents traveled throughout France, gathering endorsements for the call to try Boniface before a general council. Pressure was applied to clergy, nobles, towns, and universities to support the king's cause. For many, the choice was clear: side with their king, physically present and wielding concrete power within France, or with a distant pope whose authority, however theoretically supreme, had limited practical effect on their daily lives. The French clergy found themselves in a particularly difficult position, caught between their spiritual allegiance to the pope and their political loyalty to the king. Philip made their choice easier by threatening charges of treason against those who opposed him. Under this pressure, most French bishops and abbots eventually aligned themselves with the royal position, though often with careful qualifications designed to preserve their theological orthodoxy. By the summer of 1303, Philip had secured the nominal support of much of the French church and nobility for his campaign against Boniface. The king also sought international allies, sending emissaries to other European courts to present his case against the Pope. He found a particularly receptive audience in Italy, where Boniface had made numerous enemies during his stormy pontificate. Chief among these Italian enemies were the Colonna family, one of Rome's powerful noble clans. The Colonnas had opposed Boniface since the beginning of his pontificate, questioning the validity of his election following Celestine V's unprecedented resignation. The conflict had escalated into open warfare in 1297, when Boniface had excommunicated the entire family, confiscated their properties, and even ordered a crusade against them, razing their stronghold at Palestrina to the ground. Two Colonna cardinals, Giacomo and Pietro, had fled to France after their family's defeat and found refuge at Philip's court. They eagerly joined the campaign against Boniface, providing insider knowledge of the Roman Curia and lending credibility to the charges against the Pope. Their testimony was particularly valuable in supporting the claim that Boniface had improperly engineered Celestine's resignation and subsequent imprisonment. Meanwhile, in Italy, Boniface remained largely unaware of the extent of Philip's preparations. While he knew of the accusations made against him at the Louvre Assembly, he may not have fully appreciated the seriousness of the threat. In the summer of 1303, the elderly pontiff retired to his native Anagni, a hilltop town about 40 miles southeast of Rome, seeking respite from the summer heat and political tensions of the Eternal City. Despite this retreat, Boniface continued to prepare his response to Philip's provocations. He drafted a new bull, Super Petri Solio, upon the throne of Peter, which would have formally excommunicated Philip IV, released his subjects from their oaths of allegiance, and declared all treaties with France null and void. This was the nuclear option of medieval politics, effectively deposing Philip as King of France. Boniface planned to publish this bull on September 8, 1303, the feast of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary. Had this bull been issued and taken effect, the consequences for European politics would have been profound. France might have been plunged into civil war as nobles loyal to the Church challenged Philip's legitimacy. Other European monarchs would have been forced to choose between recognizing Philip's authority or accepting the papal verdict. The Holy Roman Emperor might have seen an opportunity to reassert imperial claims over disputed territories. Aware of these impending papal actions through his spies in the papal court, Philip decided to act preemptively and decisively. The plan he authorized was breathtaking in its audacity. Nogrit would lead a small force to Italy, join with local allies, seize Boniface physically before he could publish the bull of excommunication, and bring him to France to face trial before a general council. This plan represented an unprecedented escalation in the conflict between papacy and monarchy. Physical violence against the Pope's person had previously been almost unthinkable in European politics. Even during the most bitter conflicts between popes and emperors in previous centuries, direct assault on the pontiff himself had rarely been contemplated, much less attempted. Nogrit departed France in the summer of 1303 with a small band of loyal men and substantial funds. Upon reaching northern Italy, he made contact with various Italian enemies of Boniface, including Sciarra Colonna, the hot-headed younger brother of the exiled Colonna cardinals. Sciarra had personal reasons for hating Boniface, having allegedly been forced to eat a page of one of Boniface's bulls when captured during the earlier conflict with his family. Together, Nogrit and Colonna recruited a substantial force of several hundred armed men from among the mercenary companies and disaffected nobles of northern and central Italy. Many were motivated by payment from French funds, others by personal grievances against Boniface or his Caetani family. This mixed band of French and Italian soldiers represented an extraordinary coalition of interests united by opposition to Boniface. As August turned to September 1303, Nogrit's force moved stealthily toward Anagni, where Boniface was still residing in the family palace. Their plan was to strike just before September 8th, preventing the publication of Super Patrisolio and capturing the Pope in one decisive action. Secrecy was essential, as Boniface was surrounded by household guards, and the citizens of Anagni were generally loyal to their native son who had brought prestige to their small town. The audacity of the plan matched the gravity of the situation. If successful, Nogrit would achieve an unprecedented coup, physically controlling the supreme spiritual authority of Western Christendom. If he failed, he faced certain excommunication and possible execution as an attacker of the Pope's person, a sacrilege of the highest order in medieval law. By early September, all the pieces were in place for the most shocking confrontation between secular and spiritual power since Emperor Henry IV had stood barefoot in the snow at Canossa in 1077 to beg Pope Gregory VII's forgiveness. But whereas that earlier conflict had ended in a symbolic submission of imperial to papal authority, the impending clash at Anagni would represent a far more direct and physical challenge to the Pope's position. As Nogrit and his forces converged on Anagni in the first days of September 1303, the elderly Boniface, approaching his mid-70s, remained focused on preparing his bull of excommunication against Philip. Protected by the walls of his family palace and the seemingly loyal townspeople of Anagni, the Pope had no inkling of the storm about to break upon him. The most dramatic and violent episode in the long struggle between papacy and monarchy was about to unfold in the narrow streets of a small Italian hill town. The plan to kidnap Pope Boniface VIII represented one of the most audacious political operations of the medieval period. Its primary architect was Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip IV's most trusted legal advisor, and a man driven by both political calculation and personal animosity toward the papacy. Understanding this extraordinary scheme requires delving into Nogrit's background, the careful preparations he undertook, and the network of allies he assembled in Italy. Nogrit came from humble origins in southern France, specifically from the region of Languedoc that had been devastated by the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathar heresy in the early 13th century. Family tradition held that his parents or grandparents had been persecuted as Cathars, with some accounts suggesting they had been burned at the stake. While the exact details remain uncertain, this background appears to have instilled in Nogrit a deep-seated resentment toward papal authority and the institutional church. Despite these origins, Nogrit had risen through the ranks of royal service thanks to his exceptional legal mind. Trained at the prestigious law school of Montpellier, he had caught Philip's attention through his rigorous defense of royal prerogatives against ecclesiastical privileges. By 1303, Nogrit held the position of Keeper of the Seals, effectively serving as the kingdom's chief legal officer and one of Philip's closest confidants. Nogrit's legal expertise proved invaluable in formulating the strategy against Boniface. He understood that physically attacking the Pope would be seen as sacrilege by many Christians. Therefore, he developed an elaborate legal justification for the operation. According to Nogrit's theory, Boniface was not a legitimate pope, but a pseudo-pope who had obtained his position through fraud and maintained it through heresy and other crimes. As such, Nogrit argued, apprehending Boniface was not an attack on the papacy, but a defense of the true church against a criminal usurper. This legal framework served multiple purposes. It provided moral cover for those involved in the operation, assuaging potential religious qualms. It offered a justification that Philip could present to other European monarchs and his own subjects. Most importantly, it transformed what might have been seen as an act of violence against the church into a righteous defense of the faith. With Philip and Nogrit casting themselves as protectors of Christendom rather than attackers. With this ideological foundation in place, Nogrit turned to the practical details of the operation. Philip provided him with extensive funds, reportedly around 100,000 florins, an enormous sum for the period. This money would be used to hire mercenaries, bribe officials, and secure the cooperation of Italian allies. Nogret also carried letters from Philip authorizing him to negotiate with Italian powers and raise forces in the king's name. Nogret departed France in June 1303, traveling in disguise and with a small entourage to avoid drawing attention. His first stop was northern Italy, where he made contact with various enemies of Boniface I. Chief among these were representatives of the Colonna family, whose bitter feud with Boniface made them natural allies in the French scheme. The Colonna-Boniface conflict had deep roots in the factional politics of Rome and central Italy. The Colonnas were one of Rome's oldest and most powerful noble families, controlling extensive territories and wielding significant influence in the College of Cardinals. They had opposed Boniface from the beginning of his pontificate, questioning the validity of his election following Celestine V's controversial resignation. The conflict had escalated dramatically in 1297, when the Colonna cardinals Giacomo and Pietro had openly challenged Boniface's legitimacy, prompting the Pope to excommunicate the entire family and declare a crusade against them. The resulting military campaign had ended in disaster for the Colonnas. Boniface's forces had captured and destroyed their stronghold at Palestrina, confiscated their properties, and forced the family into exile. Many Colonnas had fled to France, where they found a sympathetic ear in Philip IV, eager to gather ammunition against Boniface. By 1303, the Colonnas were burning for revenge, making them ideal partners in Nogret's enterprise. Sciarra Colonna, the fiery younger brother of the Colonna cardinals, emerged as Nogret's most important Italian ally. Sciarra had personal reasons for hating Boniface beyond a family feud. Captured during the earlier conflict, he had allegedly been humiliated by papal forces before escaping. Some accounts claim he was forced to eat a papal bull, though this may be later embellishment. What is certain is that Sciarra harbored a violent hatred for Boniface and would prove the most aggressive participant in the coming attack. Beyond the Colonnas, Nogret recruited support from other disaffected elements in the complex political landscape of central Italy. The lords of Sicano and Supino, local nobles with grievances against the Caetani family, Boniface's clan, joined the conspiracy. So did representatives from the city of Ferentino, which had clashed with papal authority. Even some officials from Anagni itself, Boniface's hometown, were persuaded to support the plot, either through bribes or because of local factional disputes. With these Italian allies secured, Nogret began assembling his force. The exact size of this army remains debated, with estimates ranging from a few hundred to nearly 1,000 men. It likely included a corps of French knights and sergeants who had accompanied Nogret from France, supplemented by Italian mercenaries, hired with French gold and contingents provided by the Colonnas and other allied nobles. This mixed force presented certain command challenges. The French and Italian components had different military traditions, spoke different languages, and followed different leaders. Nogret, though the official head of the expedition, as Philip's representative, had limited military experience. Sciarra Colonna, with his knowledge of the local terrain and burning desire for revenge, likely handled many of the tactical aspects of the operation. Secrecy was paramount to the mission's success. If Boniface received warning of the approaching force, he could flee to Rome or another secure location, surrounded by loyal guards and supporters. To maintain the element of surprise, Nogret divided his forces into smaller groups that traveled separately, converging only as they approached Anagni. Movements were conducted primarily at night, with the troops staying in the territories of allied nobles during the day to avoid detection. As August 1303 drew to a close, Nogret's force reassembled in the vicinity of Anagni, concealed in the estates of sympathetic local lords. Scouts were sent to gather intelligence on the Pope's security arrangements and the layout of the town. Nogrit needed this information to finalize his assault plan and identify potential collaborators within Anagni itself. Anagni presented both advantages and challenges for the operation. As Boniface's hometown and the seat of his family power, it was familiar territory for the Pope, who owned a substantial palace there. However, this same local connection meant that Boniface felt secure in Anagni, potentially making his security arrangements less stringent than they might have been in Rome. The town's small size and relative isolation also meant that once Nogrit's force had seized control, it would be difficult for outside help to reach the Pope quickly. The intelligence gathered by Nogrit's scouts revealed several key factors that would shape the assault plan. Boniface was indeed residing in his family palace in Anagni, guarded by a relatively small contingent of papal guards and household retainers. The town was surrounded by walls with several gates, all normally guarded by local militia. Most importantly, the scouts identified potential collaborators within Anagni itself, notably Adinolfo and Niccolao Marzio, members of a prominent local family with their own grievances against the Catonists. With this information in hand, Nogrit finalized his plan. The assault would take place in the early morning hours of September 7th, 1303. Just one day before, Boniface planned to publish his bull, excommunicating Philip. The attack force would be divided into several groups. One, led by the Marzio brothers, would secure the gates of Anagni, allowing the main force to enter the town. Another group would occupy the main square and key streets, preventing the townspeople from coming to the Pope's aid. The main assault team, led by Nogrit and Sciarra Colonna, would attack the papal palace directly. Once Boniface was captured, the plan called for him to be quickly secured and transported out of Anagni toward the coast, where arrangements had been made for a ship to carry him to France. There, he would face the general council that Philip had been calling for, which would presumably confirm the charges against him and remove him from office. The speed of the operation was crucial. The longer Boniface remained in Italy, the greater the chance that supporters would rally to his cause. What exactly Philip intended to happen to Boniface after his capture remains somewhat unclear. The official plan called for a church council to try him on the charges of heresy, simony, and other crimes. Whether Philip genuinely expected such a council to convict Boniface, or whether he had more direct measures in mind, is difficult to determine. Some historians have suggested that Philip may have intended Boniface to die in captivity before ever reaching France, providing a convenient solution while avoiding the direct stain of papal murder. Nogrit's own intentions may have differed somewhat from his king's. His personal hatred for the papacy, rooted in his family's alleged persecution during the Albigensian Crusade, suggests he may have harbored more violent ambitions toward Boniface. Similarly, Sciarra Colonna's well-documented rage against the Pope indicated that he might not be content with a peaceful capture and trial. These potentially divergent goals among the conspirators would later create tension during the actual attack. For the moment, however, all were united in the immediate objective: to capture Boniface before he could excommunicate Philip and bring him under French control, striking a decisive blow in the struggle between papal and royal authority. As the conspirators made their final preparations on September 6th, they could not have fully anticipated the historical significance of their actions. The planned attack represented not merely another episode in the ongoing conflict between Philip and Boniface, but a fundamental challenge to the medieval order that had prevailed for centuries. Never before had a Christian monarch authorized the physical seizure of the Pope himself. The audacity of the plan reflected both Philip's determination to assert royal sovereignty and the weakening position of the papacy relative to emerging national monarchies. The attack on Anagni would mark a watershed moment in European history, regardless of its immediate outcome. If successful, it would demonstrate that even the Pope, the supreme spiritual authority in Western Christendom, was not beyond the reach of temporal power. If it failed, the sacrilege of attacking the Pope's person would shock Christian Europe and potentially rally support to the papal cause. Either way, the events about to unfold in the small Italian town would reverberate far beyond its ancient walls. As night fell on September 6, 1303, Nogrit gathered his captains for final instructions. The force was ready, the plan was set, and dawn would bring the most audacious political kidnapping attempt of the medieval age. In the papal palace, the elderly Boniface, unaware of the forces assembling against him, prepared for the feast of the Nativity of the Virgin the following day, when he intended to issue his bull excommunicating the King of France. Neither the Pope nor his would-be captors could foresee exactly how the coming confrontation would unfold, but both sides recognized the enormous stakes involved. The centuries-old question of supremacy between spiritual and temporal authority was about to be tested not in theological debates or legal pronouncements, but through direct physical confrontation. Dawn broke over the hills of Latium on September 7th, 1303. The small town of Anagni, perched on its promontory about 40 miles southeast of Rome, began to stir with the normal activities of a late summer morning. Merchants opened their shops, farmers brought produce to market, and the town's churches prepared for the vigil of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary, an important feast in the medieval liturgical calendar. For the townspeople, it seemed like any other day. They could not know that by nightfall, their hometown would enter the pages of history as the site of an unprecedented assault on the supreme spiritual authority of Western Christendom. Inside his family palace near the cathedral, Pope Boniface VIII was already awake and at work. The elderly pontiff, now in his 70s, was finalizing the text of his bull Super Petri Solio, scheduled for proclamation the following day. This document would pronounce the formal excommunication of King Philip IV of France, releasing his subjects from their oaths of allegiance and effectively deposing him. It represented the ultimate weapon in the papal arsenal, and Boniface was prepared to use it despite knowing the upheaval it would cause throughout Europe. Boniface had chosen to issue this momentous decree from Anagni rather than Rome for both practical and symbolic reasons. Practically, Anagni offered greater security than the factious city of Rome, where the Colonna family and other enemies maintained influence despite their exile. Symbolically, issuing the bull from his hometown, where his family held sway, emphasized Boniface's personal authority and connection to the lands of central Italy that formed the core of the Papal States. The Pope's security arrangements reflected his confidence in Anagni's loyalty. His personal guard was relatively small, consisting of household knights and retainers rather than a substantial military force. The town's defenses were manned by the local militia, drawn from the citizenry, and presumably loyal to their famous native son, who had brought prestige to their small community. This sense of security would prove catastrophically misplaced. As the morning progressed, unusual movements began at Anagni's gates. Guards loyal to the Marzio family, who had been secretly recruited by Nogrit's agents, took control of several entrances to the town. Shortly after sunrise, they opened the gates to admit the first contingents of Nogrit's force, who entered quietly in small groups to avoid causing immediate alarm. These advance parties took up positions at strategic points throughout Anagni, particularly the approaches to the main square and the papal palace. Around 9 in the morning, the main body of the attack force arrived at the gates. Nogrit himself, accompanied by Sciarra Colonna and a substantial force of armed men, now openly entered Anagni. As they marched through the streets toward the town center, they raised the royal banner of France alongside the Colonna family standard. They also reportedly shouted slogans that revealed the dual nature of their mission. Death to Pope Boniface. Long live the King of France. The sudden appearance of an armed force bearing hostile banners and shouting threats against the Pope finally alerted the townspeople to the danger. Anagni's bells began to ring in alarm, calling the citizens to arms. However, the response was confused and disorganized. Many residents, seeing the substantial force already controlling key points in the town, simply barricaded themselves in their homes. Others, particularly those with connections to the Caetani family, attempted to reach the papal palace to reinforce its defenses. These attempts at resistance were largely thwarted by Nogrit's careful planning. His forces had already secured the main approaches to the palace, preventing reinforcements from reaching the Pope. Meanwhile, some citizens of Anagni, either through prior arrangement or opportunism, actually joined the attackers. The town's podesta, chief magistrate, Adolfo de Mattia, who had been secretly aligned with the conspiracy, now openly supported Nogrit, lending a veneer of local legitimacy to the attack. By mid-morning, fighting had broken out in several parts of Anagni as papal supporters clashed with Nogrit's forces and their local allies. The advantage, however, lay firmly with the attackers, who were better armed, more numerous, and benefited from the element of surprise. Gradually, resistance in the town was overcome, leaving the papal palace isolated and vulnerable. The palace itself, while substantial, was not designed as a military fortress. It was the Caetani family residence, expanded and embellished as Boniface's status rose, but lacking the formidable defenses of a true castle. Its main protection came from its thick stone walls and a modest contingent of papal guards. As Nogrit's forces surrounded the building, these guards prepared for a siege, barricading the main entrances and taking up defensive positions. Nogrit initially attempted negotiation, sending a herald to demand that Boniface surrender himself voluntarily to face the charges against him before a general council of the church. This approach aligned with his legal justification for the mission and would have simplified the task of transporting the Pope to France. Unsurprisingly, this demand was firmly rejected by the papal household. Boniface, informed of the situation, reportedly declared that he would die before submitting to such an indignity. With negotiations failed, Nogrit ordered an assault on the palace. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously. The main force, led by Sciarra Colonna, attempted to force the main entrance, while smaller groups sought other points of entry. The papal guards, though outnumbered, initially put up effective resistance, holding the attackers at bay through the early hours of the assault. As the attack continued without immediate success, Nogrit sought alternative means of entry. Local knowledge provided by his Anagni collaborators proved crucial. The attackers were directed to houses adjacent to the palace, which they occupied and then used to break through connecting walls. Other accounts suggest they set fire to a wooden door leading to the palace gardens. By early afternoon, these flanking maneuvers had succeeded in creating breaches in the palace defenses. With entry points secured, Nogrit's forces poured into the palace. The remaining papal guards were quickly overwhelmed, though not without inflicting casualties on the attackers. Room by room, the invaders searched the palace for Boniface, looting valuable items as they went. The papal treasury, containing substantial funds and precious objects, was a particular target for the mercenary elements among Nogrit's force. Contemporary accounts describe gold, silver, and sacred vessels being seized in quantities so great that some were scattered and lost in the streets during the attackers' hasty departure days later. Inside the palace, Boniface heard the sounds of fighting drawing nearer. Rather than attempting to flee or hide, the elderly pope made a remarkable decision that reflected both his sense of personal dignity and his conception of the papal office. He ordered his attendants to bring him the papal regalia, the mantle, the tiara, papal crown, and the keys of St. Peter. Clothed in these symbols of his office, and seated on the papal throne, Boniface awaited his attackers. This dramatic scene has been recounted in various sources, some more reliable than others, but the essential elements appear consistent. As Nogrid, Sciarra Colonna, and their armed followers burst into the papal chamber, they found not a frightened old man, but the Vicar of Christ arrayed in full pontifical splendor, holding a crucifix and the keys of St. Peter. "Here's my neck, here's my head," Boniface reportedly declared. "I, a Catholic, legitimate Pope, and Vicar of Christ, wish to die for the faith of Christ and his Church." This dignified tableau momentarily gave even the hardened attackers pause. Nogrid, educated and mindful of his king's instructions to bring Boniface to France for trial, rather than harm him, attempted to assert control of the situation. He formally read out the charges against Boniface and demanded that he abdicate the papacy and submit to custody to face trial before a general council. Boniface's response was defiant. According to multiple accounts, he compared himself to Christ before Pilate and declared that he would die before relinquishing his office to the agents of the French king. "Betrayed like Christ," he reportedly said, "if I must die, I shall die as Pope." This steadfast refusal enraged Sciarra Colonna, whose hatred for Boniface was more personal and visceral than Nogrid's political animosity. What happened next remains somewhat contested in the historical record, with accounts varying in their details. According to some sources, Sciarra Colonna struck the Pope in the face with his metal gauntlet, drawing blood. Other accounts suggest he threatened Boniface with a knife and was only prevented from killing him by Nogrid's intervention. Still others describe verbal abuse, but no physical violence. What seems clear is that Boniface was subjected to threatening and humiliating treatment, if not outright physical assault. Nogrid, however, maintained control of the situation sufficiently to prevent Boniface's murder. Whatever his personal feelings toward the Pope, he was mindful of his mission's objectives and the consequences of killing the pontiff outright. A murdered Pope would become a martyr, potentially rallying support to the papal cause. Moreover, Philip's plan required that Boniface be tried and deposed by a church council to legitimize his removal. A dead pope could not be tried. Having secured Boniface's person, Nogrid now faced the challenge of extracting him from Anagni and transporting him to France. This proved more difficult than the initial capture. The assault had created considerable disorder in the town, with looting and violence continuing throughout the day. More problematically, news of the attack was already spreading to neighboring communities, where it was met with shock and outrage. The unprecedented nature of the assault on the Pope's person violated deeply held religious sensibilities, even among those who might have had political disagreements with Boniface. Nogrid decided to delay their departure until arrangements could be properly made. Boniface was placed under guard in his chambers, denied contact with the outside world, but not physically restrained or removed from the palace. Nogrid calculated that controlling Anagni for a few days would allow time to organize a secure escort to the coast, where ships were waiting to transport the Pope to France. This delay proved to be a critical miscalculation. While Nogrid and his forces controlled the papal palace and much of Anagni, they could not prevent news of the attack from spreading. Throughout the evening of September 7 and into the following day, word reached neighboring towns and villages. The reaction was not what Nogrid might have hoped. Rather than viewing the attack as the legitimate apprehension of a criminal pseudo-pope, as Nogrid's legal theory suggested, local populations perceived it as a sacrilegious assault on the Vicar of Christ. By September 8, the feast day on which Boniface had planned to issue his bull against Philip, the Pope remained a prisoner in his own palace. The attack had succeeded in preventing the formal proclamation of Philip's excommunication. However, the situation in Anagni was growing increasingly unstable. The initial shock among the townspeople was giving way to anger, particularly as the excesses of Novgorod's forces became apparent. Looting had extended beyond the papal palace to churches and private homes, and there were reports of violence against civilians. More worryingly for Novgorod, armed men were beginning to gather in the countryside around Anagni. Cardinals who had been staying in nearby towns were rallying support among the local nobility. The Orsini family, traditional rivals of the Colonnas and therefore inclined to support Boniface, were reportedly assembling a relief force. The longer Novgorod remained in Anagni, the greater the risk of being trapped and overwhelmed by superior forces. Inside the palace, the captive Boniface endured what must have been a deeply humiliating experience. According to some accounts, he was denied food and water for a period, though these claims may be exaggerated. What is certain is that he was held under guard, prevented from communicating with the outside world, and subjected to continued demands that he abdicate and submit to French custody. Throughout this ordeal, the elderly pontiff maintained his refusal to yield, insisting on the legitimacy of his position and the sacrilege of those who had attacked him. As September 8 drew to a close, Novgorod faced a difficult decision. The operation had succeeded in capturing Boniface and preventing the issuance of Super Petri Solio, but extracting the Pope from Anagni was proving problematic. The mood in the town was shifting, and reports indicated that relief forces were approaching. Novgorod needed to act quickly before his position became untenable, yet moving Boniface through potentially hostile territory carried its own risks. The events of the next day would resolve this dilemma, but not in the way Novgorod had planned. The attack on Anagni had succeeded in its immediate objective of capturing the Pope, but maintaining control of both Boniface and the town was proving more challenging than anticipated. The audacious assault had sent shockwaves through Christendom, but its ultimate outcome remained uncertain as tension built in the occupied town. The morning of September 9th dawned with tension hanging over Anagni. For 2 days, the small Italian town had been under the control of Guillaume de Nogaret's forces. Pope Boniface VIII remained a captive in his own palace, surrounded by hostile guards and subjected to demands that he abdicate and submit to French authority. Novgorod faced growing pressure to extract the Pope from Anagni before local resistance or outside intervention could thwart his mission. Yet events were already turning against the French royal agent and his Italian allies. Throughout the previous day, rumors had spread through the surrounding countryside. Tales of the armed assault on the Pope, the looting of sacred treasures, and the mistreatment of the Vicar of Christ inflamed local sentiment. While Boniface had not always been popular, even among his countrymen, the sacrilegious nature of the attack transcended ordinary political divisions. To lay violent hands on the Pope himself struck at the heart of medieval religious sensibilities. By the morning of September 9th, the citizens of Anagni had overcome their initial shock and begun to organize resistance against the occupiers. The turning point came when a prominent local noble, Cardinal Luca Fieschi, rallied the townspeople with an impassioned appeal to defend their pope and expel the foreign invaders, crying death to the traitors. Long live the Pope. Fieschi led a growing crowd through Anagni streets. The tide turned quickly. Novgorod's forces, which had seemed overwhelming just 2 days earlier, now found themselves outnumbered by angry locals. Many of the Italian mercenaries, sensing the changing situation and perhaps having satisfied their desire for plunder, abandoned their posts or even switched sides. The Anagni militia, initially neutralized by the surprise of the attack, reorganized and joined the uprising. By mid-morning, significant portions of the town had slipped from Novgorod's control. Inside the papal palace, the French and Colonna loyalists found their position increasingly precarious. The growing crowd outside, armed with improvised weapons and agricultural implements, threatened to overwhelm the reduced guard. Sciarra Colonna, whose personal vendetta against Boniface had driven much of the violence during the initial attack, urged a last desperate assault on the Pope before retreating. Nogret, however, recognized the futility of such action and the additional dangers it would create for their escape. As the situation deteriorated, Nogret made a difficult decision. Rather than risking capture or death in a doomed attempt to maintain control of Boniface, he ordered a withdrawal from Anagni. The French and their remaining allies hastily gathered what portable loot they could carry and prepared to fight their way out of the town. Before departing, Nogret made a final attempt to convince Boniface to accompany them voluntarily, arguing that the local population might turn against him once the French protection was removed. The Pope, understanding the shifting dynamics better than his captor, flatly refused. The retreat quickly descended into chaos. As Nogret's diminished force attempted to leave Anagni, they encountered growing resistance in the streets. Local residents, emboldened by their numbers and the weakening of the invaders, attacked from windows and rooftops. The narrow medieval streets became battlegrounds where the French knights' military training offered limited advantage against the press of angry townspeople. Some of Nogret's men never made it out of Anagni. Contemporary accounts describe French soldiers pulled from their horses and killed by the mob. Others were captured and later ransomed or executed. Nogret himself and Sciarra Colonna, along with a corps of their most loyal followers, managed to fight their way to one of the town gates and escape into the countryside. Their flight marked the inglorious end of Philip IV's audacious attempt to kidnap the Pope and bring him to France for trial. Back in the papal palace, a very different scene was unfolding. As the last of Nogret's guards fled or surrendered, Cardinal Fieschi and the leaders of the Anagni uprising entered to find Pope Boniface still in his chambers, physically unharmed but deeply shaken by his ordeal. According to some accounts, the Pope wept with relief and gratitude when he saw his rescuers, blessing them and thanking them for their loyalty. The citizens of Anagni, having expelled the invaders, now treated Boniface as a returning hero. He was escorted to the town square where, according to chronicler Giovanni Villani, he addressed the crowd, forgiving the people of Anagni for their initial failure to protect him and granting them absolution. This public reconciliation helped cement the narrative that would soon spread throughout Europe. Boniface as the victim of sacrilegious violence who had maintained his dignity and authority even in captivity. Despite this triumphant moment, Boniface's physical and mental condition had been severely affected by the trauma of the attack. At around 70 years old, he had endured 3 days of captivity, humiliation, threats, and possibly physical mistreatment. Contemporary accounts suggest he had been denied adequate food and water during his confinement. The psychological impact of such treatment on an elderly man, accustomed to the highest reverence and authority, must have been profound. Recognizing the Pope's weakened state and the continuing danger from Nogret and the Colonnas, who remained at large in the surrounding countryside, Cardinal Fieschi and other loyal clerics arranged for Boniface to be escorted to Rome. On September 10th, with a substantial guard of local nobles and their retainers, Boniface departed Anagni for the relative safety of the Eternal City. The journey to Rome, though only about 40 miles, proved difficult for the aging pontiff. His physical frailty, exacerbated by the ordeal at Anagni, made the travel along medieval roads challenging. Nevertheless, Boniface was determined to return to the symbolic heart of his authority. On September 13th, 1303, he entered Rome, where he was received with appropriate ceremony by the Roman nobility and clergy. In Rome, Boniface took residence in the Vatican Palace, surrounded by loyal cardinals and guards. News of the attack at Anagni had preceded him, generating shock and outrage throughout Christendom. Even rulers who had opposed Boniface's policies generally condemned the physical assault on the Pope's person as beyond the bounds of acceptable political conflict. Philip IV himself, when news of the failed kidnapping reached Paris, reportedly distanced himself from Nogret's actions, claiming his agent had exceeded his instructions. Despite this supportive environment, Boniface's health continued to deteriorate rapidly. The combination of advanced age, the physical hardships of captivity, and the psychological trauma of the attack proved too much for his constitution. Contemporary accounts describe the Pope as becoming increasingly unstable in the days following his return to Rome. Some sources suggest he suffered from fever and delirium, while others describe periods of uncontrollable rage, alternating with deep depression. On October 11th, 1303, just 1 month after the attack at Anagni, Pope Boniface VIII died in the Vatican. The exact cause of death remains uncertain, with various accounts attributing it to fever, stroke, or simply the cumulative effects of age and trauma. Some more sensationalist sources suggested suicide or even murder, though most historians discount these theories as lacking credible evidence. Boniface's death marked the end of an era in papal history. He had been the last pope to make a comprehensive claim for papal supremacy over secular rulers in the tradition of Innocent III and Gregory VII. His successor, Benedict XII, would adopt a more conciliatory approach toward Philip IV, seeking to heal the breach between the papacy and the French monarchy. The funeral of Boniface VIII reflected the controversial nature of his pontificate. While he received the traditional honors due to a pope with elaborate ceremonies in St. Peter's Basilica, the proceedings were marred by continuing political tensions. The Colonna family and other Roman factions that had opposed Boniface remained hostile even after his death. According to some accounts, there were disturbances during the funeral procession, and the tombs of Boniface's relatives were desecrated in acts of posthumous revenge. Boniface was entombed in an elaborate monument in St. Peter's, reflecting his lifelong appreciation for magnificent art and architecture. The tomb, created by Arnolfo di Cambio, featured a recumbent effigy of the Pope and decorative elements that emphasized the dignity and authority of the papal office. However, this physical memorial would be destroyed during the demolition of the old St. Peter's Basilica in the 16th century to make way for the current structure. News of Boniface's death spread quickly throughout Europe, generating varied reactions. In France, Philip IV and his court received the news with evident satisfaction. The king had achieved his immediate objective of preventing his excommunication, though not in the manner he had planned. Rather than capturing Boniface and subjecting him to a show trial, circumstances had removed the troublesome pope more directly. In other European courts, the reaction was more complex. While few rulers had supported Boniface's extreme claims of papal authority, many were disturbed by the precedent set at Anagni. If the Pope himself could be physically attacked with impunity, what security could lesser ecclesiastical authorities expect? The attack seemed to represent a dangerous breakdown in the traditional boundaries between spiritual and temporal power. For the church hierarchy, Boniface's death created an immediate succession crisis. The College of Cardinals, meeting in conclave in October 1303, faced the difficult task of choosing a successor who could navigate the treacherous political landscape created by the conflict with France. Their choice fell on Cardinal Niccolò Boccassini, who took the name Benedict XII. Benedict, a Dominican friar known for his moderate temperament, faced the nearly impossible task of repairing relations with France while maintaining the dignity and independence of the papacy. His approach was conciliatory, but careful. He absolved Philip IV of any personal responsibility for the attack at Anagni, while L excommunicating Nogaret and others directly involved in the assault. This compromise allowed both sides to save face. Philip could maintain his innocence of direct involvement, while the Church could affirm the sacrilegious nature of the attack without directly condemning the French monarchy. Benedict's pontificate, however, proved remarkably brief. After only 8 months as pope, he died suddenly in Perugia on July 7, 1304. The timing of his death, just as he was preparing more comprehensive measures to resolve the conflict with France, has led some historians to suspect poisoning, though there is little concrete evidence to support this theory. Whatever the cause, Benedict's death reopened the question of papal succession at a critical juncture in church-state relations. The resulting conclave was one of the longest and most divided in papal history. For nearly 11 months, the cardinals debated and maneuvered, with pro-French and anti-French factions unable to reach the necessary 2/3 majority for election. Finally, on June 5, 1305, they elected Bertrand de Goguy, the Archbishop of Bordeaux, who took the name Clément de Viclement's election, marked a decisive shift in papal politics. Though not formally a French nominee, he had good relations with Philip IV and was not from the Italian circles that had dominated the papacy for centuries. More significantly, Clement never traveled to Rome after his election. He was crowned in Lyon and eventually established the papal court at Avignon, beginning what would later be called the Avignon Papacy, or by critics, the Babylonian captivity of the Church. Under Clement, the resolution of the Boniface affair reached its anticlimactic conclusion. In a series of meetings and agreements with Philip IV, Clement effectively nullified Boniface's most controversial pronouncements without formally condemning his predecessor. The bull Unam Sanctum, which had so angered Philip with its claims of papal supremacy, was interpreted in a way that stripped it of its political implications. The records of Philip's campaign against Boniface were expunged from royal archives, creating a kind of official amnesia about the entire affair. For the participants in the attack at Anagni, the aftermath brought mixed fates. Guillaume de Nogaret, despite his excommunication by Benedict XII, continued to serve Philip IV as a trusted advisor. He eventually secured absolution from Clement V, though under conditions that required penances and pilgrimages he never completed before his death in 1313. Sciarra Colonna was gradually rehabilitated into Roman politics, even serving briefly as a senator of Rome before fading from the historical record. The immediate victims of the attack, beyond Boniface himself, included his nephews and supporters who lost positions of influence with his death. The Caetani family's power, which had risen dramatically during Boniface's pontificate, declined significantly in subsequent years, though they remained important figures in central Italian politics. As for Philip IV, he had won a decisive victory in his struggle with the papacy, though not precisely in the manner he had planned. The failure of the kidnapping attempt at Anagni was overshadowed by the ultimate outcome, a papacy that no longer challenged French royal authority and eventually relocated to French-influenced territory. Philip would continue his program of centralizing royal power until his death in 1314, establishing precedents that would shape the development of the French monarchy for centuries. The most profound impact of the Anagni attack and Boniface's subsequent death, however, lay in what it revealed about the changing balance of power in medieval Europe. The traditional authority of the papacy, based on spiritual prestige and the ability to wield excommunication as a weapon, had been directly challenged by the emerging power of the national monarchy, backed by efficient bureaucracy, legal expertise, and territorial control. Though the attack itself had failed, the underlying shift in power that it represented would continue to reshape European politics throughout the coming centuries. The attack on Pope Boniface VIII at Anagni in September 1303 lasted only 3 days, but its repercussions would echo through centuries of European history. while the immediate drama ended with Boniface's death a month later. The deeper significance of this event lay in how it accelerated the transformation of the relationship between church and state in Western Christendom. What happened at Anagni was not merely a failed kidnapping attempt, but a symbolic turning point that marked the decline of papal supremacy and the rise of national monarchies as the dominant political form in Europe. The most visible consequence of the Anagni outrage emerged under the pontificate of Clement XII, elected in 1305 after the brief reign of Benedict XII. Clement, a Frenchman born Bertrand de Goa, had served as Archbishop of Bordeaux before his elevation to the papacy. Though not directly a creature of Philip IV, Clement maintained cordial relations with the French monarch and demonstrated a willingness to accommodate royal interests to an extent that would have horrified Boniface VIII. Most significantly, Clement never set foot in Rome during his entire pontificate. After his coronation in Lyon, he established his court in various French cities before settling in Avignon in 1309. Though Avignon was technically not part of the Kingdom of France, but belonged to the county of Provence, a fief of the Holy Roman Empire, it sat just across the Rhone River from French territory and was deeply influenced by French culture, language, and politics. This relocation, initially presented as temporary, would stretch on for nearly 7 decades. From 1309 to 1376, 7 consecutive popes, all French, would rule from Avignon rather than Rome. This period, known as the Avignon Papacy, or, more pejoratively, the Babylonian captivity of the Church, a biblical allusion to the ancient Jews' exile in Babylon, fundamentally altered the character and perception of the papacy throughout Europe. The Avignon Papacy developed a reputation for fiscal sophistication, administrative efficiency, and cultural patronage. The popes constructed an imposing palace complex that still dominates Avignon's skyline today, established an extensive bureaucracy, and rationalized the church's financial systems. Under their direction, the papal administration became perhaps the most advanced governmental structure in Europe, employing hundreds of clerks, lawyers, and financial specialists. Yet, this very efficiency came at a cost to the papacy's spiritual authority. As the Avignon administration expanded, so did its need for revenue. The popes developed increasingly sophisticated methods for extracting money from throughout Christendom, including annates, a tax on newly appointed bishops, expectancies, payments for the promise of future church positions, and various dispensation fees. These practices, while fiscally effective, generated growing resentment, particularly in regions like England and Germany that saw their wealth flowing to a papacy perceived as a French satellite. For Philip IV, the relocation of the papacy to Avignon represented a stunning strategic victory. Without formally subjugating the church, he had effectively neutralized it as an independent power capable of challenging French royal authority. Clement VIII proved remarkably accommodating to Philip's demands, most notably in the controversial case of the Knights Templar. The Templars, a wealthy military religious order founded during the Crusades, had evolved into a sophisticated financial institution that had loaned substantial sums to the chronically indebted French crown. In 1307, Philip ordered the simultaneous arrest of all Templars in France on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and various sexual perversions. Despite the dubious nature of these accusations, extracted primarily through torture, Clement eventually acquiesced to Philip's pressure and suppressed the order entirely in 1312. This episode demonstrated how dramatically the balance of power had shifted since Boniface's time, with the papacy now unwilling or unable to resist even the most transparent power grabs by secular authority. More directly relevant to Boniface's legacy was Clement's handling of the charges against his predecessor. Philip, not content with Boniface's death, continued to press for a posthumous condemnation of the dead pope as a heretic, which would have retroactively invalidated all his acts and pronouncements. Clement, walking a diplomatic tightrope, eventually engineered a compromise. The most explicit records of Philip's campaign against Boniface were removed from royal archives, while a papal bull declared that the king had acted from righteous zeal. The charges against Boniface were neither pursued nor formally dismissed, creating a strategic ambiguity that allowed both sides to save face. This resolution epitomized the new relationship between papacy and monarchy. Conflicts would be managed through negotiation and compromise, rather than through the grand theological pronouncements and dramatic confrontations that had characterized the age of Boniface. The papacy's retreat from claims of supremacy over secular rulers would become permanent, with future popes focusing increasingly on their role as spiritual leaders and Italian territorial princes rather than as supervisors of the international political order. Beyond the specific case of France and the papacy, the Anagni incident accelerated broader changes in the European political landscape. Throughout the 14th century, the universal institutions that had defined the medieval period, the Church and the Holy Roman Empire, gradually lost ground to the rising power of territorial states with distinct national identities. In England, Edward IV and his successors consolidated royal authority through the development of common law and parliamentary institutions. The Hundred Years' War between England and France, beginning in 1337, would further strengthen national identities on both sides of the Channel. In Spain, the gradual reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule was creating the foundations for the unified Spanish monarchy that would emerge by the end of the 15th century. Even in fragmented Italy and Germany, territorial princes were asserting greater independence from imperial authority. This shift toward territorial sovereignty was accompanied by intellectual developments that provided theoretical justification for the new political reality. Thinkers like Marsilius of Padua, whose Defensor Pacis, 1324, explicitly rejected papal claims to temporal authority, and William of Ockham, who defended secular rulers against ecclesiastical encroachment, developed sophisticated arguments for the separation of spiritual and temporal powers. These ideas found receptive audiences in royal courts throughout Europe, where monarchs were eager for intellectual support in their ongoing efforts to centralize authority. The decline of papal political authority did not, however, mean an immediate decline in the Church's broader cultural and social influence. Throughout the 14th century, the Church remained a dominant institution in the daily lives of most Europeans. It controlled education, administered charity, defined moral standards, and provided the ritual framework that gave meaning to human existence from birth to death. The papacy itself, despite its political setbacks, maintained significant authority in purely religious matters and continued to serve as a focus for Christian unity. Nevertheless, the seeds of more profound challenges to ecclesiastical authority had been planted. The Avignon papacy's fiscal policies, combined with perceptions of moral laxity and excessive French influence, damaged the institution's prestige throughout Europe. This damage would be compounded by the Great Schism, 1378-1417, when competing papal claimants in Rome and Avignon divided the loyalty of Western Christendom, further undermining the papacy's moral authority. By the early 15th century, calls for substantial reform of the Church in head and members were growing increasingly insistent. The conciliar movement, which argued that general councils of the Church held authority superior to that of the Pope, gained significant support, temporarily eclipsing papal authority at the Councils of Constance, 1414-1418, and Basel, 1431-49. Though the papacy eventually reasserted its supremacy within the Church hierarchy, these challenges marked a permanent diminution of its unquestioned authority. The longer-term consequences of these developments would become fully apparent only in the 16th century, with the Protestant Reformation and the further consolidation of sovereign states. Martin Luther's challenge to papal authority in 1517 would find fertile ground partly because of the institutional weaknesses and damaged prestige stemming from the Avignon period and subsequent conflicts. The Reformation, in turn, would accelerate the process of state formation as rulers throughout Northern Europe seized the opportunity to nationalize their churches and appropriate ecclesiastical resources. Looking back from a broader historical perspective, the attack on Boniface VIII at Anagni stands as a crucial moment in this long transformation of European political structures. It did not single-handedly cause the decline of papal authority or the rise of the sovereign state, both of which were complex processes with multiple causes extending over centuries. But it did provide a dramatic demonstration of the changing balance of power and a symbolic turning point that contemporaries recognized as significant. The nature of this significance is captured in a famous comment attributed to Cardinal Benedetto Caetani, not to be confused with Boniface, who had the same birth name, in the aftermath of the Anagni attack. The fleur de lis of France has entered into the chambers of the Church, and the world will never be the same again. The fleur de lis, symbol of the French monarchy, had indeed penetrated the previously inviolable sanctuary of papal authority, not just physically but conceptually, breaking a taboo against direct confrontation that had protected the papacy even during previous conflicts with secular rulers. What made the Anagni outrage particularly significant was not just its unprecedented nature, but the relative lack of consequences for its perpetrators. Previous confrontations between popes and rulers had often ended with the secular authority making public penance, as when Emperor Henry IV stood barefoot in the snow at Canossa in 1077 to beg forgiveness from Pope Gregory VII. After Anagni, there was no such dramatic submission. Guillaume de Nogaret eventually received absolution from Clement Foy, but under such lenient conditions that it amounted to vindication rather than punishment. This lack of meaningful consequences signaled to contemporaries that the rules had fundamentally changed. The Pope was no longer untouchable, physically or politically. Spiritual sanctions had lost much of their deterrent power when confronted with the material resources and administrative capacity of the emerging nation-state. The balance had shifted decisively away from the universal authority claimed by the medieval church toward the territorial sovereignty that would characterize the modern state system. For the papacy itself, the legacy of Boniface VIII and the Anagni attack would remain ambiguous. Later, popes would occasionally reassert versions of Boniface's claims to universal jurisdiction, particularly during the Counter-Reformation period. Yet, they never again advanced these claims with the comprehensive theoretical foundation or practical force that Boniface had attempted. Instead, the papacy gradually adapted to its diminished political role, focusing increasingly on spiritual leadership, doctrinal authority, and cultural patronage. The modern papacy, as it emerged from these centuries of transformation, retained significant moral influence in international affairs, but without claims to direct political authority over secular rulers. This evolution represented both a retreat from Boniface's vision of papal supremacy and a pragmatic adaptation to changing realities that allowed the institution to survive and even flourish in altered form. For Philip IV, the confrontation with Boniface represented a pivotal moment in the development of French royal authority. His victory, achieved through a combination of legal argumentation, propaganda, and ultimately force, established precedents for royal independence from ecclesiastical oversight that would shape French political development for centuries. The Gallican liberties, the distinctive rights claimed by the French crown in ecclesiastical affairs, had roots in Philip's successful defiance of papal authority. Beyond France, the Anagni incident provided a template for state-church relations that would gradually spread throughout Europe. The principle of cuius regio, ius religio, whose realm, his religion, formally established by the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, but implicit in political developments since the 14th century, reflected the new reality that territorial rulers, not universal church authorities, would determine the religious character of their domain. The modern international system, with its foundation in the sovereign territorial state, thus owes a significant debt to the confrontation between Boniface VIII and Philip IV d'Artois. While numerous other factors contributed to this development, from technological changes to economic transformations, the dramatic rupture in traditional authority relations represented by the Anagni attack helped clear the path for new political forms and theories. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the conflict, however, lies in what it revealed about the changing basis of political legitimacy in European society. Boniface had relied on traditional claims of spiritual authority, backed by theological arguments and the threat of excommunication. Philip countered with appeals to emerging concepts of national interest and sovereignty, backed by effective administration, legal expertise, and ultimately physical force. The latter approach proved more immediately effective, pointing toward the more materialist conception of power that would characterize modern political thought. In this sense, the confrontation between Boniface and Philip represented not just a power struggle between two ambitious individuals, but a clash between medieval and modern conceptions of political order. The assault on Anagni in 1303 did not mark the definitive triumph of the modern state. That process would continue for centuries, but it did signal that the medieval synthesis of spiritual and temporal authority under papal guidance was no longer sustainable in its traditional form. As we reflect on this dramatic episode from more than 7 centuries ago, we can see in it the seeds of political developments that would shape the modern world. The principle of state sovereignty, the separation of religious and political authority, the decline of universal institutions in favor of territorial powers, and the increasing primacy of material force over spiritual sanctions in international relations. The French king's goons, who attacked and attempted to kidnap the Pope in 1303, were not merely carrying out a tactical operation in a political dispute. They were, unwittingly, helping to usher in a new era in European political organization, whose consequences continue to resonate today.